Okay, we're going to get started. On behalf of the Let's Talk About Sex Committee, I just want to say thank you guys for coming out tonight for the Sexuality and Shame panel. We're going to get started here in a second, but after the panel is done speaking, we're going to have a time for question and answers. And it'll appear over here on the screen, but as we get started, if you have questions that come to mind, we're going to be using Poll Everywhere. So you can feel free to text in your questions. I'm going to give you the number that you're going to text into now because it won't be on the screen until a little later. But you can text to 37607. So I'll say that one more time. The number is 37607. And then you'll just text the phrase "no shame" and then your question to that number. And we'll take those questions towards the end.
Welcome, everybody. It's so nice to see your beautiful faces. I'm Dr. Tina Schermer Sellers, and I teach in the Marriage and Family Therapy program here at Seattle Pacific University. I'm a family therapist. I'm also a clinical sexologist, and I'm also a Christian. Those things usually don't go together, but with me they do. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about me. So several years ago, let me back up a bit. One of the classes that I teach in our program is the Graduate Human Sexuality course, and it's a class that all the people who are studying to be family therapists have to take. It's a required course that you have to take for your state licensure. And so I've been teaching it for over 20 years. And one of the things that our students have to do in that class, you're gonna all gasp, they have to write their sexual autobiography. The reason that we have our students do that, if you can even imagine such a thing, is that if you're gonna grow up and be a therapist, you have to know what your stories are. You have to know what your life experience has been. And the vast majority of people have grown up in families that were really pretty silent around sexuality, or were silent and shaming around sexuality. So as a therapist, if you don't know what your story really has been and you haven't dealt with your stuff, then it means when you're being a therapist, whatever your stuff is might impact the way you're doing therapy, and then that's not ethical treatment. So we require our students to write their sexual autobiography. Well, about 15 years ago, I began to notice that many of my students who had grown up in conservative religious backgrounds were describing levels of sexual shame that were significantly greater than the years previous. And I tried to figure out what was going on. And through lots of talking to students and talking to other people, what I realized was I was beginning to see the first wave of students that had grown up in the purity movement, the True Love Waits, sort of stuff that came out of the early 90s. And I Kissed Dating Goodbye and some of the other books and stuff. And it had had a pretty profound effect on people's sense of themselves and how they felt about their bodies and sexual desire and their experiences, and they felt really bad about themselves in really big ways. And it was playing out, even those people who later had relationships or got married, it was playing out in their relationships in ways where there was lots of sexual dysfunction and other things like that. So I began to become really concerned that the church wasn't managing sexuality in a healthy way. So began doing lots of writing and researching on that. Last summer, I started a project called ThankGodForSex.org, and that's what this up here on the board is about. It is a website that is modeled after the itgetsbetter.org project that Dan Savage and his partner Terry Miller started. And it's a community-built website where people can put up their videos of their stories of growing up in the purity movement or in some kind of a conservative story where they felt really bad about their sexuality, but then later began to question that God maybe never meant for them to feel that way. And they tell their story about how they began to reclaim their sexuality and their faith and heal. And on that website, you can listen to videos, you can read people's stories. We've gone out and found bloggers that are writing really intelligently about how to integrate healthy sexuality and faith. We've got resources on there on integrating faith and sexuality in healthy ways, on adult sex ed, on raising your kids in healthy ways that integrate sexuality and spirituality. So just trying to be a place to find great resources so that you don't have to feel like you have to choose between healthy sexuality and healthy faith. So that's kind of how that's all been. So lots of work around that. So we have a panel of some really awesome people that I'll let introduce themselves to you. And we wanted to spend tonight just opening it up and letting you have a safe place to ask whatever question you wanted to about sexuality, about faith, about how to be in relationship with your body and sexuality in a way where you can feel really good about it.
Hi there. My name's Shawn Whitney, and I'm actually a graduate of the MFT program here at SPU. And so Tina has read my sexual autobiography, so if you want any details, you can ask her, because I'm sure not going to share them. And I now serve as assistant director in the Student Counseling Center on campus, and also adjunct in the MFT program here on campus. So I wear a couple of different hats, and in my role as a therapist, found my conversations around sexuality really linked, as Tina was saying, to issues of guilt and shame. And we'll talk about the difference between those tonight, I'm sure, but really then leaning much more profoundly towards shame and how shame can be very silencing. And so as a result, I was hearing from both men and women, not just college age on campus, but even in my work in private practice, around the fact that there aren't many, rather, safe spaces to talk about sexuality and how we make meaning of it in our lives. And so in an attempt to kind of push back against the silence and provide some space for folks to talk, that's why tonight involves your opportunity to text in questions, because we really want to be able to reduce the shame about asking about anything that you might be curious about, but also to normalize that likely your experience isn't very different from the person sitting next to you or even the other people in this room. And yet shame can cause us to feel like we're the only one. It can be very isolating in a way. And so we're hopeful that that can be minimized in some way, and really appreciate you coming tonight.
Hi, my name is Amy Balmer, and I'm a pastor with the Vineyard, and have had, I don't know, just probably since 1994 maybe, been involved in some capacity of Christian leadership. That's a lot of years, and have been well exposed in that time to the really confusing and damaging messages around sex in regards to both men and women. Messages that shame and vilify and bring fear. And I think my hope for us tonight is that we kind of blow some of that off a little bit. I hope a lot of it, but even just a little bit would be so good. I'm well aware of how confusing it all is. It's still a little confusing for me, and I've been having sex for a really long time, and it's still like, wow, new things. We hear so many just loud screaming messages from our culture, and we hear just as loud messages from the church. Oftentimes, I think they're very much the same. And we'll talk more about that later. But what gets put on us, I think, so often in the church is that guilt and shame, when we're actually getting from the church a similar message. So I'm excited about tonight.
Hi there, I'm Daniel Tidwell, and I am, what should I say about myself? So I am an assistant instructor in the theology side of the house over at the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology. I have an MDiv from that institution, and I'm involved at St. Paul's Episcopal Church just down the hill. I recognize a couple of faces in the room. from there. And I also do some writing on a blog. And there's a series that I've been doing for a little over a year called Queering the Christian Table that is being reposted on the thankgodforsex.org site. So you could check it out there. But much of my, so a little bit about my background is I grew up, my parents were in the ministry, and I grew up in Georgia. You may not be able to tell it from my accent, but there's a little twinge there, in the Pentecostal church. And so I have some roots in the sort of Wesleyan holiness background myself. And so it's fun to be in this place. I'm now Episcopal. The question that I think drives me the most in this conversation is actually the question of holiness. It's the question of like what does God want for us to flourish as human beings? What is the trajectory of God's desire for us and for our desires? So that's kind of my motivation in this conversation. I look forward to see where we go with you all tonight.
So we would love to hear your questions, just to guide this conversation wherever you'd like for it to go.
As they're shifting to the texting screen, one thing I will say that I had mentioned in my intro was some of the difference between guilt and shame. And one of the things that I think is important to talk about in our time is when we throw different terms out to intentionally address kind of our working definitions or understandings of them. And when I think about guilt, I think about this idea of something that we do, some sort of activity or decision or even behavior that we engage in that we feel bad about, that we in that case have some guilt about. Whereas shame's interesting in that it's often then maybe a similar experience that we'd had in our lives that then we interpret and internalize as we are bad. So it's the difference about feeling bad about doing something and being bad. And so shame is kind of that thing that resides in us that really is interpreted as a character flaw or something wrong with us, even if it was an experience that we had that was perpetrated on us or done to us. And oftentimes around sexuality, we use the word shame intentionally because sexuality is a very sacred thing, and it involves our soul as much as anything else in our lives, right? And so when our spirits are impacted at some level, then we internalize it much less as guilt and more as shame. And that's why we're having the conversation tonight, is because we're mindful of the impact that shame can have on our lives beyond the guilt feelings that we can have.
One of the ways to kind of differentiate a little bit, as Shawn is saying, and the way that I often think about it with sexuality, is guilt is when we're old enough to have an idea that something is wrong, and we decide to do that thing anyway. So we have an idea that we shouldn't do something, and then we go ahead and do it anyway. And we usually feel bad about it, and so it's motivating to not do that thing again. Guilt is actually motivating. We don't like that feeling. But with shame, we've usually gotten in trouble, if you will, for something we had no idea why. So for example, with sexuality, the way it often happens is you have a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old, like a 3-year-old who's in the bathtub and they touch their genitals and they're like, wow, this feels awesome, right? They're in the tub and somebody walks in on them and gets all upset. Now, the 3-year-old is being perfectly normal. They are just discovering their body, but somebody unloads on them, and they have no way to make sense of why this person that they love and are strongly attached to just got so angry with them. So they can't feel guilt because they had no volition around this thing. All they can do is feel badly about themselves as a whole. Does that make sense? Or if a 5-year-old, 2 5-year-olds or 5 and 6-year-olds are playing look-see, they're playing doctor, that's what they do. I won't ask how many of you did because that would embarrass you, but it's really normal if you did. And somebody walks in and gets all upset. Again, kids being perfectly normal, perfectly curious. That's just what kids do at that age. They're discovering how each other's bodies are different. But then somebody who's uncomfortable with sexuality and doesn't really know that that's normal developmental curiosity unloads on them. And then they have no way to make sense of it. So what they feel is not guilt, they feel shame. And that is, I must be bad. I just did something that was out of my normal curiosity. I got in trouble, so I must be bad. Does that make sense? So it really attributes to the whole sense of self, and it really affects your sense of self-worth.
So it looks like we have questions starting to come up over there.
So the first one is, I came from a conservative background and wish my family taught me about sexuality. Do you feel there is value in going back to your family to ask?
Well, I think it depends on who your family is. I love it when my students who are in grad school, when they do this assignment, I actually ask them to go back and to have some conversations with their adult parents if that feels safe enough and they feel brave enough to do that and they don't feel like it's going to destroy relationships or anything, because it's a way to actually help your relationship with your parent move to a more adult level, to have conversations, adult conversations about sexuality. But you're the best one to judge whether the timing is right to have that conversation. So you really have to judge where your parents are in their development and where you are in your development as to, are they ready to have those conversations? Are you ready to have those conversations? But if you are, I say, yeah, go for it. Be brave, be vulnerable, walk in and say, I don't think we did this as well as we could have, and I know it might be late, but could we start having these conversations now? I think that would be great. I will also say, though, if that doesn't feel safe, definitely inform yourself. We have resources on the website. Get books and teach yourself about your body, about just how magnificent the creation of your body is and what a gift it is. Learn about it, know about it, have all kinds of knowledge about it, and don't turn that over to culture. Be informed, because it's power for you to be aware of what a wonderful creation you are.
I would add too, so sitting up here as a gay man, I would say trust your instincts on this one, and also again, take care of yourself. To recognize your parents are people, and they have stories, and they have their own, they will have experienced their own sexual shame in their lives. And particularly if you are LGBTIQ, somewhere in there, it could be a dangerous thing. That shame stacked with social messages and context, depending on where you come from and what that situation is. Take care of yourself. Have a plan to take care of yourself well. That's a great conversation to have if you feel like you're in a good place and you have a good support system around you to do that.
Next question is, what's a single Christian to do with sexual desire?
Well, it's just to be clear, it's not a use it or lose it thing. So let's just get that out there. However, it can be suppressed, and if there's shame on top of it, then it can be numbed and you can completely dissociate from it. And that's not good. I think the first important thing to know is that your sexual desire is good, and understand that it's good, that God actually created you with sexual desire. The moment you feel aroused by someone, or that's not a sinful, awful, horrible thing. There's a difference between lust and sexual desire. And I'm not sure how many people know that or talk about it. We tend to not talk about sexual desire up from the pulpit. We talk about lust and just slam real hard down on it. But how I would describe lust is desiring to possess someone for your own gain, to exploit them for your own purposes. Whether that be to feel powerful, to feel needed, to feel loved, to feel desired, versus your sexual desire is part of how you're made, how your body's made, how your soul, your spirit's made together with your body. It's not something completely separate. I think that's another thing that's really important to know, is that your desire isn't something that's separate from your spiritual life, your soul. It's integrated. We're integrated, embodied people. And so that's not something that is healthy for us to try to shove off into the corner. So knowing first and foremost that it is really a good thing, and it's a sign that you're healthy, and it's part of how God designed you. That's the first thing. Somebody want to pick it up from there?
There's this wonderful old Jewish story from about 500 BC about the rabbis of this village, and they were all upset because people were not managing their sexuality well. They were very, very promiscuous, and so they all go into the Holy of Holies and they beg God, do something with this desire. It's just getting the best of the people. Make it go away. And so they beg and beg, and God says no, and they beg and beg, and God says no, and they beg and beg, and God says no, and they beg and beg, and finally God says okay. And then out of the Holy of Holies jumps this line of fire and goes across the whole village. And the next day, the hens aren't laying eggs, no one's going to work, the artists aren't creating. A huge depression settles over the whole village. And the rabbis realize that at the core of sexual desire is all desire for life. It's literally the breath of God. All of our creative energy is the same creative force that's in our sexual desire. It's a really, really good thing. Now, we have to manage our desire in all kinds of places in our life. You know, when my kids were little, if I wanted to get up and go hike all day on a Saturday, I couldn't leave them behind in the house just because I wanted to go hiking, right? I had this desire to go hiking. I gotta go hiking. I gotta go hiking. I don't leave them behind. I have to manage that desire. You're managing desire all the time in your life. You know, you're not like, oh, I really want to go to class right now. Like sometimes you don't, right? You have desires to do other things. I'm just sure of it, right? But you're managing desires. So your sexual desire is a piece of that, and you're having to manage it at sometimes. But like Amy's saying, you don't make it bad. You learn about it. You try to understand it. You see it as a really wonderful force in your life, in ways that are honoring to you and honoring in your relationship with God. You understand your own arousal cycles and how your juices are made, and you're really grateful for how you're put together, but you treat your sexual desire in a way that feels like it's honoring. It makes it something that's really wonderful and something that feels precious to you and something that's a gift, just like the way you take care of the other desires in your life. It's part of the same kind of thing. It's all good, and you try to keep it in some kind of a balance with the other things in your life that are important to you.
So I want to chime in on this question by trying my hand at the next question, which is, what is the purpose of sex and sexuality, and who is it for? Because I think for me, my framework is not therapeutic. My framework is theological, and so I'm gonna sort of root myself there. I really, Jesus has this beautiful summation of the law and the prophets, like to love God and to love neighbor. And so for me, like I feel a bit like a broken record in these sorts of conversations, but I have to keep coming back and re-asking this question about sexual desire, like what is it for? What's the purpose? Like why does God create a world and say, damn, this is good? He's talking about the world that he's created. God has created this world. God has created us as sexual beings and says, this is good. Like there's this sort of popular conversation arising about shifting the conversation around consent from, it's not a conversation about having a no, but it's a conversation about an enthusiastic yes. God is the originator of the enthusiastic yes. God says enthusiastically yes to us. And so the purpose of our desire, our longing for connection with another that comes from God, and so the question then of how do I steward my sexuality? What do I do with sexual desire? Well, it comes to that question of, is what I'm doing increasing my love for God? Is it increasing my love for my neighbor? Is it increasing, like, as I am engaging myself and my body and my desires with someone else, am I growing in my capacity to love this other person that I am with? Am I growing, and is this other person that I'm with growing in our capacity to love our neighbors and to love the world? And for me, that question, like, that's at the heart of, like, holiness. That's that question of, like, what does God want to cultivate in us? God wants our sexuality to be alive and thriving so that we can love the world better. That's my theological answer that I would offer.
Questions? Are people texting? Yes. Give me a nod. Moderators in the back. Don't mind this awkward lull.
One of the things that I think about with the most recent question was, what was I told growing up and even at your age, going to a Christian college as you are, about what the purpose of sex is? And sadly, a lot of the information I got in youth group and in college even was sex is for procreation in the context of marriage, period. And although that's not untrue, it's one aspect of what our sexuality is. That there is a procreation element to intercourse in particular, if that's what we're talking about. But that just begins to scratch the surface of what God intends for our sexuality, as Daniel was talking about theologically, and as I talk a lot with folks on an emotional and spiritual level around really being able to experience what the intimacy of the Trinity is about. That somehow, some way, there's this ongoing negotiation and exploration of other in a very connected and intentional way. And when I think about sexuality, even as I express it with my children and with my wife and with my friends and family, there's a way in which it's not accidental. It's not something that I happen upon. It's something that I have to bring kind of an intentional effort and focus to in my dealings with them, because it's a way for connection beyond the small talk or just the everyday dealings around kind of transactional things, right? That expressing my sexuality, at least as I feel God has intended it, is more of a transformational experience. That as I express it and experience it in relationship with other people, that it changes me. And it changes them in ways that are really much more supernatural than I can even wrap my head around. And so, Daniel, when you use the word connection, what that sparked in me was, yeah, that's really what I resonate. Not that I didn't resonate with everything else, but that's something that I resonated with in what he just said around, if my sexuality is just for procreation, that's very transactional from my perspective. And that would be disappointing, because I don't believe that God gives us gifts to just use transactionally. That he gives us gifts to really form and change us and the people that we're in relationship with. And so I'm mindful of how even my relationship with my wife, as an example, has changed me and changed her in ways that I couldn't have scripted or anticipated, because of that sacred kind of connection and relationship that we share in the expression of our sexuality. And so too with my sons. I walk in on them playing with themselves in the bathtub, and I have a choice in that moment, as Tina said, to either shame them and tell them that what they're doing is inappropriate, or celebrate the fact that God created them to experience pleasure in their lives. And I'm glad that I had kids after I got a little education and exposure beyond the messages that I'd received growing up in youth group, that I was able to then say, isn't that amazing how good that feels? And isn't it amazing that God intends us for pleasure with each other in relationships in ways that blow our minds? And it's with gratitude that I am able to parent them around their sexuality, because many of the messages that we receive are limiting. They put a period before the rest of the story. And my hope is that the rest of the story is one that you can take back to your parents, related to a previous question, and share. Because I'm mindful that many of them received messages similar to mine that were really truncated and not the full explanation, God's intention.
Go ahead. I wanted to just tag just for a second on the concept of the word transaction. You want to? One of the most harmful teachings I think that the church has done regarding sex, and men and women in particular, is that women give sex to get love. That's how we're made. And that men give love to get sex, because that's just how they're made. And men really don't need love, they just need sex. Women really don't need sex, they just need love. And that is just a straight up lie. And I would encourage every single person in this room to avoid the Christian bookstore section on marriage.
Amen.
Because I have yet to read...
She's a pastor, by the way. I just want to point that out.
I have yet to read a book, and I check every so often, and I walk out of there just so mad. I have yet to read a book that really names that women get horny and we want sex. We want good sex. Let me rephrase that. Look at all the women nodding. They're like, yes, we do. We want good sex, not boring sex, not bad sex. We want good sex. We like that kind. And we might, feel, because we've been told, like, okay, I feel connected, even though this is really boring and not so good. At least we feel connected. They're all laughing because they know it's true. But we like great sex. And you know what, men? You're designed for love. You're designed for intimacy. It's such a crock that you guys just are driven by sexual desire. Yes, you've got just higher levels of testosterone. Your drive's a little higher than us until we reach about 40. And then it changes. It does. And I just got sidetracked.
Why did you get sidetracked, Dan?
Maybe you just need a drink of your water.
Too. That lie is not. Don't buy into it. That's that. What ends up happening is that sex becomes a transaction, even in marriage. In fact, it's talked about in these books oftentimes that women, just pick a day. I kid you not. This is in a book. Pick one day a week, women. I know this isn't your thing, but pick one day a week, wives, and just start in the morning. Prepare yourselves and get yourselves in the mindset that you're going to have sex with your husband. Take a bath, go for a walk, have a glass of wine, and just know that this is the one day a week. This is what you're going to do for your husband, because he needs it. It's where he gets value, and he needs it. Where do I sign up for a marriage like that? Well, that sounds awesome. So it is not a transaction. It's something that we're designed to enjoy together, to enjoy freely and frequently, and beautifully and intimately and with fun and laughter and tears. And it's not a transaction.
I love you, Amy.
I want to clarify, men don't like bad sex either, just so you know. That's an equal opportunity thing.
Well,
So actually, bad sex doesn't take much effort. Good sex takes a lot of effort. So I just want to throw that.
I think they settle for it unless they've had good sex, though.
That's true.
There you go. There you have it. No, it's true. No, I'm so glad that you jumped in on the transaction thing, and I want to underscore that, because not only are there those messages that are so prevalent in the Christian church, they are also very prevalent in a slightly different way inside a market-driven culture like the one we live in. So, for example, the vast majority of porn is written by men for men, which means it's on a male arousal cycle, which is much faster than most female arousal cycles. God made men's arousal cycles like microwaves, women's like crock pots. They're different. So if men grow up, and we do not have comprehensive sex education in America, so we do not teach healthy sexuality. So the vast majority of people get their sex education from pornography and the media, because they're not getting it from their parents and they're not getting it from comprehensive sex education. Well, what you get from media is a male-oriented arousal cycle that is fast. And all the girls there are always ready, hot, all the time. So when guys hear from church and culture that they're supposed to want it in a particular way and in a particular timing, and girls are hearing that they're supposed to want it in a guy's kind of way, in a guy's kind of timing, and then they're supposed to not think about it for themselves because they're just supposed to give it to him, then what happens is they have a kind of sexual transaction that is relatively fast, relatively unconnecting, and so it becomes boring and the same, like it's the same kind of dance. So therefore it becomes boring fairly quickly. And so sexual desire tanks really quickly in the relationship. And then they end up in Shawn and my office. So what we need to be teaching is understand your body. Understand that God gave you an amazing heart, an amazing body, amazing mind, an amazing soul. Take the time to really learn about yourself. Take the time in your relationships to really have a high value for the kind of person you connect yourself with, both in your friends and then when you start dating. And take your time to connect with somebody slowly and carefully. And then understand that you are going to take the time to really learn about somebody else. And if you're a guy and you're heterosexual, then you're going to be with somebody whose arousal cycle is likely significantly different than yours, and you're going to want to study her and learn her. And she might be behind the 8 ball in learning about her body, because she might have had a whole lot of messages that said it was not okay for her to know about her body, because if she did, we called her a slut, right? Because we slut shame all over the place. So she might be very timid about letting you know about her. So you have to just be so patient to take the time to learn about each other until you get to the place where you're giggling and laughing and having fun and being silly and remembering that it isn't about a transaction. It isn't even about intercourse. It isn't even about orgasms. It's about deep connection and deep pleasure. And if those two things are happening every single time you're together, then love is made. And if more love is made, then you are in the world in a different way, like Daniel was talking about. Then more love is between you, and then you go out in the world, and you're in the world in a way that God's love is more in the world.
The next question was, sex before marriage. Please share on value/wisdom in different perspectives.
So I want to leap in. It's only within the last couple years in Washington State that a legal marriage would even be possible for someone like me sitting on this stage. And there's lots of debate about that in the church. So this question is an interesting one to me because it sort of hangs on these two terms, sex and marriage. And I think we should probably back up a little bit. I think the question is about sexuality, and that's something that we have our whole lives. It's part of who we are, and if you're defining sex, much like if you define marriage as being between a man and a woman, and sex can only be between a man and a woman, if you're talking about only like vaginal intercourse, man and a woman, well then like I apparently can't have sex at all. So I guess I can't have sex outside of marriage. But if we're saying, oh no, actually, like there's a lot to our sexuality. It's about this connection, this relationship, this ongoing interplay of my desire being called out when I'm around somebody else. Where's the line between like giggling with your crush in the cafeteria versus having sexual intercourse? Like, is there a line there? Like, I think a lot of the messages that I got growing up in the church was like, there's a boundary and this is where it is. We've neatly defined it right here. It's, and so shorts have to be this length on your thigh and we'll have a ruler and we can, it gets to the point of absurdity sometimes. And the question becomes completely unhelpful at that point. And so to begin to say, like, what do I do with my sexuality in relationship to another person? And to recognize, like, I don't have any interaction with any person where my sexuality isn't at play in some way. Now, clearly, there are places and different types of relationships where that looks different. It's never like for me, my sexuality's at play because I'm alive and I'm breathing. I have desire, I have interaction, I'm compelled, I'm drawn towards another person, I interact with them. But it gets expressed very differently. I teach. I'm not gonna, develop a sexual relationship with my students. There are questions about consent and mutuality and all these sorts of things that we can talk about. But we begin to then say, okay, so what is this idea of marriage? Well, the Bible gives us so many different versions of marriage. But I think what we can say is there's something that we believe as Christians that God has called for something of two different people being able to connect and go beyond themselves through that movement of love. And so the question of sex and marriage, well, that marriage is then a place of commitment where we say, oh, this is the place where I'm going to most fully express myself. And to be able, that commitment, what that does, my understanding of that is that it gives a space where you can trust to be vulnerable. To be sex positive doesn't mean to be permissive of utter promiscuity. Like, there is so much room for pleasure in our lives, and for sexual pleasure. But as Christians, I think in Christian theology, and I'm not going to assume that everyone in the room is a Christian, but this is the framework that I come out of, is that Christian theology offers this question of a God who self-discloses. It's God who makes God's self vulnerable in the world through being human. That's our image of both who God is and who we are to be as people. And so to be people shaped in the way of Jesus, we make ourselves vulnerable. And a commitment like marriage is a space where we have boundaries around us that allow us for increased vulnerability over time. And so my hope would be that you would value your sexuality enough that as you're moving into sexual experiences, whether that's outside or inside marriage, that it's moving in this direction of vulnerability, of opening up in spaces and recognizing that there may be a space that God is inviting you to, where you actually give to someone else that kind of commitment, where you can live into more vulnerability than you could even imagine without that.
I guess I just want to say with that question, sometimes when we talk about the question of sex before and after marriage, we are often, I don't know if I can say this or how to say this, but it feels like we're talking about it from a place of almost like, I don't know, not entirely like what can we get away with, but something like that. I can't quite find the words, but there's a part of me that wants to say, what's the best it can be? Like, what's the best it can be? Like, have we ever really sat around together and asked ourselves, what's the best sex God wants us to have? Like, really. He gave it to us. It's strong. It's worldwide. It has been in humans forever and ever, ever. Amen. It always will be. When the Hebrew people believed as babies were born and they took their first breath, that was the breath of God entering their body, and desire entered their body just like that, and they sought the breast, right? That's pleasure and connection right there, right then. If you walk down the halls of an Alzheimer's unit, you don't have to have a brain, a memory anymore. People are still seeking connection and pleasure. It is so hardwired into us. It's the first thing we get. It's the last thing that leaves us, you know? Unless we're so sick or in pain or really, really depressed, if we're at all functioning in our body, we want connection and pleasure. It's so innate in us. So what's the best it can be? Well, I think when we start having a conversation about what's the best it can be, when is sex and sexuality in its freest, most expressive, most beautiful state, then I think we have to talk about things like safety and trust and vulnerability. And when we start talking about that, then we talk about things like absolute commitment with somebody I absolutely trust, I know absolutely has my back, I know loves every fiber of my being. I trust them so much that I can be stark-ass naked in every way I am, in my ugliest moments, and they still love me. I can bring my craziest ideas, and they still love me. So we can explore anything we want to sexually together. I'm not afraid to bring who I am. And in that place, with that person, where there's that much commitment and that much safety and that much trust, and that much intimacy, you can have a quality of sexual relationship that far exceeds what you can have in the back of the car when you're 17 with somebody you might not see the next day. Do you see what I mean? So I think it's an interesting conversation to have around what's as good as it gets and what does it take to have that, and how do we work ourselves towards some of that, at least to have some of that before we die, yeah? I want y'all to have a whole mess of that. I want my kids to have a whole mess of that. I mean, that was my goal when I was raising my kids. How do I help them have a vision for this, and how do I raise them so that they know that I want them to have the very best sexual relationship in their lives as they grow, and that they are the kinds of people that know how to pick the kinds of partners so that they can have really deep, loving relationships that allow for deep, loving sexual relationships that are fun and crazy, even if I never hear a tiny word about it. I would want that for every single one of you.
The next question is, how do I deal with my shame?
So there's 4 things I think of when I think of with shame, and I'll let you guys give your wisdom. So the 4 words I use are, let's see if I can remember them: claim, name, frame, and aim. Okay? So I kind of tried to put them together to make them easy to remember. So framing is get your education, learn everything you can about your body and sexuality, get the books, read, get your sex education. That's framing. Claiming is know your own story. Know your story. How are you taught about gender? How are you taught about sexuality? What makes sense to you? What does not make sense to you? Whatever does not make sense to you, did not sit right with you, go back and re-story your story. What makes it right? What makes your story right? Okay? So that the story you pass on is a corrected story from the story you got. Okay? So, framing, claiming, oh no, I'm not going to remember. Naming, aiming. Oh no, I don't remember. Shoot, darn.
Really good. She wrote it down in a book. The book will be out hopefully later this year or early next year, so I encourage you to purchase it.
So, let's see, tell your story.
Frame it and aim.
Oh, darn.
Yeah, but frame.
Oh, shoot. I'll remember and I'll come back to it.
It's really intentionally a
Sorry.
teaser for you to buy the book.
I was thinking if I came up with 4
Work on
things,
that
it would
one.
make it easy to remember. No, I can't even remember them, so I'll have to come back to them.
One of the things I'm mindful of with shame is that it increases with silence.
Oh, there you go. That was one of them.
Oh, okay.
I gotta tell you, you gotta talk.
The
to
joke
other
is that we share a brain, but
We do, we do.
Yeah. So I'm mindful of conversations around shame that I think gets at what this question is asking. People report to me that one of the hardest things to do is to talk about the shame in their lives, how it shows up, how it operates, how it impacts their way of being with themselves and with other people. And yet, somewhat counterintuitively, it ends up decreasing the shame over time. It doesn't always take it away. It certainly can, but at the very least, it begins to allow it to not continue to grow, to manifest, to take root in their lives the way that silence really allows shame to do. And so how to deal with shame is really being intentional about identifying a trusted other or others, I would argue, a community of folks that you can really be who you are with, that aren't going to find the first and every opportunity to kind of increase or double your shame, right? That you can be honest with about what's going on for you. And what's really interesting about that is then people respond with, well, I actually have a story too. And you begin to share your stories with each other, and you realize, wait a minute, this shame was predicated on the fact that I was the only one. And now all of a sudden I'm beginning to understand that I'm not alone, that people aren't meeting me with more shame, judgment, condemnation. They're actually meeting me with acceptance and curiosity and questions about me. And what that ends up doing then is it ends up challenging the notions that we've internalized about ourselves. And not immediately, but over time we begin to see how shame wilts in the face of this courage that we've mustered to be honest and open, that shame begins to not have as much of a stronghold on us as it once did. And we begin to then feel empowered against our shame in ways that we hadn't before. And that's one of the reasons why I really encourage people who are experiencing shame to check not only the website, but consider signing up for one of the groups in the community that we're trying to lead with licensed therapists who bring people together that are dealing with shame in their lives. And there's something somewhat unique and powerful about coming together with other people that perceive they're the only ones, right? And watching how things shift and change for you personally, but also for others that you are able to be vulnerable with.
So that's the name it part. You want to name it. You want to name your shame. Okay, because shame cannot live in the face of compassion and love. It cannot survive. Okay? And then aim is get a picture of where you really want to go, where you want it to go.
I think I would add, just from a pastoral, maybe perspective, that shame is a really powerful tool of evil. It brings with it a lot of almost like knife-like claws that embed themselves in our being, our whole being, in our body, soul, spirit. And there is much freedom to be had by naming and framing and claiming and aiming. There's so much freedom that can be had. But I also am aware of times when that component of darkness and evil is still lingering and present. And even if you're not a Pentecostal, don't let this freak you out, okay? But there is something, it's very, very powerful in being able to say just simply with another person, I reject this shame, and I call it to death on the cross of Jesus, and I resurrect life and what is true along with Jesus. Just something that simple along those lines. There is something that happens, I don't know, can't explain it, but there is something that happens when we're able to fully reject it and place that shame where it belongs. I would add that.
Amen. That's, yeah. I think, y'all, I have buckets loads of shame. So, and that stuff just like, it's the kind of bucket where it's like you live in Seattle, so you can empty it, but like it rains every day. So you just got to keep, like it doesn't go away. You don't empty it once, right? So we, like human beings, we have really fascinating minds. We actually, we seek out patterns. I don't know if you ever saw, I'm going to age myself really a lot here. Did you ever see the movie A Beautiful Mind? Okay, good. I don't feel so bad. So, it's like we all have that sort of, nearing on sort of unstable desire to seek out patterns. And so when we live in families and churches and societies that offer us these patterns of shaming messages, unconsciously our brain is soaking that stuff in. It's like, oh, this is a pattern, and it's like, oh yeah, okay, this is true. We're constructing this reality in our head based on these messages that we're getting all the time. So growing up, I was, just like everybody, absorbing these things, taking in these messages, and I would pray every night for over a decade, from the time I was about 11. I would pray every night, God, don't send me to hell for this. I couldn't say what this was, being gay. But don't send me to hell for this. I really believed God just couldn't stand who I was. And that's a really powerful thing. That's the shame. It's that thing of thinking it was something actually wrong with me. Not anything I had done, but with me. And that's a powerful message. So, it's like I do work. I read extensively. I educate myself. I get in therapy. I do all these things. I'm, okay. And I begin to contradict these messages. And that word is really important. So contra, I love contra dancing, but contra is this idea of pushing against something. The way a contra dance works is you have to like move against the other people in the dance. And so it's actually by like pushing against each other that you push each other and move through the set. And so it's this idea of something that pushes against, and think dictionary. It's to say something that contradicts, to give yourself a different message to live by. And that's where I think, how do we understand what the gospel is? And this is what you were just saying. Like what do we say no to with the shame, and what do we say yes to? What is God inviting us to? So this gets more complex when there's the personal messages of shame that we get, and then there's these bigger social messages. So when you have categories where society has privileged somebody and oppressed somebody, then you're getting these messages every day. So today on the bus, on the way to work, two people get in a fight. They're sitting right next to me. White man in business attire puts his hand on the throat of an African-American woman. So I am sitting 4 feet away, and up to this point they've been yelling. This is the point where I lunge out of my seat and get my arm and about half my chest in between the two of them. We're stuck on the viaduct, so it's like 15 minutes before we get to our stop. And in the moment, like, there's so many things happening here. There's gender, there's class, there's race, there's all these things. And in this moment, this woman reaches for the tool that society's given her to use in this situation. All she can do is call attention so that other people will witness what's happening. And to try to shame this man into recognizing what he's done is wrong. And so she begins to say, if you're a real man, you wouldn't be putting your hands on a woman. And so she then begins to proceed to call him fag for a while, as I'm standing there with my body between them. And it's not aimed at me, but it's that same message of shame that I've heard my whole life. It comes back to me, even in this moment, where it's like, oh, I can see there's like 17 different levels of like chaotic wrong happening here, social ills at play, they all intersect. What do I do? How do I contradict that message to honor my humanity and the humanity of this woman, and somehow, I don't know how, honor the humanity of this man as well? And that I think is that complex question of that for me, for us to be here the day after Easter is really compelling. Like, it is a resurrection question. What does it look like when we have been offered death? Shame is a kind of death. We've been fed that. But we have a narrative about this God-man who metabolizes death and does something with it and turns it into life. And that, to me, is where the hope is. We contradict that. And maybe if you're not a person of faith, you need to find some other way of doing that. But for me, that's where I find that, is in that narrative of resurrection.
Our next question is, what is one thing that each of you wishes the church would do differently in regards to sex and sexuality?
Just one?
So I'll start, since I was just talking. I have ideas. So I work with kids in a godly play program, which is like this Montessori kind of curriculum that we use with the kids in our church. And one thing that I love that we've just sort of developed as a practice is like inviting the kids to respect their own and each other's body space. And like when they're playing with each other, like check in with your friend. Are they still having a good time? You know, it seems like your brother's screaming when you sit on him. Like, does it seem like he's having a good time right now? Like, could you check in with him? But to me, like, this is a really basic level. It happens with really small kids of like figuring out like, oh, my body ends here and yours begins there. And it's this like process that takes, you know, until you're like in your mid-20s before your brain really is like done developing. It's like, hey, we're all learning this, you know, like, but to start that early, like, it doesn't feel like it's directly connected to sex and sexuality, but it is. It is. Like, where's your body? And are you having a good time? And is that other person having a good time right now? Check in with each other. Communicate about that. Like, that's sex, right? So, that's my 2 cents.
Oh my goodness. There are so many things. Hard to pick one. I think that one of the things that I think would make a huge difference just in how, not only in sexual relationship, intimacy, but also just in relationship in the church in general, is for the church to stop telling women that they're dangerous, that their bodies are dangerous, and that men's desire is dangerous, that they're dangerous because of their desire. I think that not only sets us up for really crappy marriages for many reasons, but it completely cripples the church and its ability to actually function together as the whole body of Christ with men and women leading together. Because what you end up with are male senior pastors who can't be alone in a room with a woman because of what he might feel for her and what she might evoke from him. Which leaves the only people who can be mentored for leadership as pastors are the ones that don't have breasts or vagina. Because it's only safe for a male senior pastor to be alone with another male.
In theory.
In theory. Booyah. Yeah. So I have a funny story about that. I actually sat in on a workshop. It was a regional conference workshop, and it was around how to have sexual integrity as pastors and leaders. And I'm one of the few women sitting there, and they're just talking, going through the list of, don't be alone with a woman, watch what be careful what you watch on TV, make sure you have a strong marriage, and blah, 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 blah. Then they show this video clip of Ted Haggard. Do y'all remember that story? Okay. Well, they show him as an example, right? Of, look at what happened to Ted Haggard. And I'm sitting there like, he was with a man. He wasn't even with a woman. So it's fine for him to be alone with a woman. He totally debunked their whole framework, their whole theory of don't be alone with a woman. And then they showed, it was just crazy, and it is crazy. It keeps men and women separate. It keeps the body of Christ separate, and it unfortunately keeps women quite oppressed in the church when they continue to, and men bound up, because men aren't able to fully engage women in relationship, and they're missing out when they can't do that. Everyone misses out.
It's hard to choose one, but one that comes to mind for me is I wish the church, or I hope, because I do think it's a realistic hope. I hope the church speaks about sexuality going forward without fear as the driving force or message. Some of what you've talked about just now, but this idea that if we're given a gift, it's not helpful to teach people how to steward a gift when all the messages are driven, connected, narrated by fear. It's just not helpful, right? And so how can we talk well and openly without fear being the driving force around sexuality? My guess is a lot of healthy things would come from that. Healthy relationships, healthier expressions of our own sexuality with ourselves and with others. Fear drives us to do interesting things. And I think while interesting can be very functional at times, if I see somebody running at me with a knife or a weapon or a gun, running is a wise thing to do. That's where my fear is a functional response. But despite what my youth pastors told me, my sexuality wasn't a weapon running at me in a dark alley. And yet that was the way it was talked to me about. Don't do this, don't do that, in very behavioral type of messages, behavior-based messages. Oh, but when you get married, it's awesome.
Yeah. Flip.
Oh, okay. So my wife and I often talk with couples, particularly dating couples, the faith community that we attend, and one of the things that she often says is, I hate to break it to you, but 45-minute ceremony didn't flip the switch for me. It didn't magically change my sexuality, my experiences with my new husband. It wasn't like we just went up to the suite and ripped each other's clothes off and had a great time. It wasn't just some automatic or instant thing. And it was because many of the messages we got were great, but not now. Stay as far away from it now, but then when you say I do, no holds barred. And that's a very confusing message that's driven by fear.
So my dream, and I like you, Shawn, I think it's so doable. And I'm having experiences that say it's possible. That we can get to a place where we begin to have open, safe, honoring conversations about what does an integrated faith, Christian faith conversation about sexuality look like? A Christian sexual ethic, what does it really look like? And how do we have a conversation about sexual health in the church? And then how do we support our parents in particular in raising their kids? And support the marriages inside the church. That's sort of where I'd like to help. And when I work with, I've done this at several churches and I've done some with youth groups, so I'll work with the kids and then I'll work with the parents and then I'll work with the kids and the parents together. And what I find is the parents feel so overwhelmed, like they don't know how to have conversations with their kids, and they're scared to death about screwing up, doing it wrong, whatever. And they are as eager to have somebody help them out as the kids are to have somebody be straight with them. And so I'm straight with the kids and I give them stuff, and then I'm straight with the parents and I tell them what's up with the kids. And then I help the parents kind of do a fishbowl where they're talking to each other honestly in front of the kids. So the kids can see how freaked out and scared the parents are. And then I have the kids talk amongst themselves in front of the parents. So the parents can hear what it's really like to be in high school now. Because the parents have no clue what it's really like. And what the kids really want from them. Because they do want their parents involved, but they want them involved in a particular way and not in another way. And they'll tell them. And so you find that when you get them doing that, it's like they're both so darn relieved. So it really does work. So I feel like if we could just continue to be brave enough to keep having those conversations in our churches, in our really healthy churches, and then start with the parents with the little ones so that they are having those conversations when they're little, when they're in the bathtub, and all that kind of thing, then we can help our parents be less scared, and people can start having more fun, and then they can be really having all those conversations so that by the time kids enter adolescence, they've actually grown up in families that have had open, safe, ongoing conversations about sexuality. And what we know is that kids who grow up in homes that have open, safe, ongoing conversations about sex and sexuality, they get involved with sex later, they make safer sexual choices, they have much less regrets about their sexual choices, and they describe themselves as closer to their parents overall. Well, that's what we want, right? We want that for everybody. So I think we could get there if we just keep prodding the conversation along.
So we have more questions than we have people in this room. Some of you have been double dipping, and so which is great. Yeah. Well, for the remainder of the time, we're going to try to we'd like respond. The name of the game is brevity. Rapid lightning round. So our next question is, what do healthy discussions about sex look like in the context of a serious relationship?
Healthy discussions in a brief, succinct way. Healthy discussions assume that you're talking. That's a healthy thing. So talking with your partner, talking with non-partners is good. That's healthy. That's healthy. Talking about your expectations, your hopes, your dreams, what feels good, what doesn't. If you can't communicate with an intimate other about what works and what is meaningful and what is pleasurable for you, it's probably not the person to be having an experience sexually with, period.
Tells you something.
So I would say that absolutely healthy discussions require talking, and health is predicated upon honesty, openness, and curiosity. And if you can embody those things with yourselves and with others, then hopefully those healthy discussions will follow.
I'm going to try to be really fast. So here's my little spiel about what I think is wrong with most porn, is that you don't see people's faces. People aren't face-to-face most of the time. So if you can't have a face-to-face conversation with the lights on with your intimate partner, then you might not be ready to be intimate with them.
Texting does not count.
Texting does not count. Yeah, texting doesn't count over the cell phone. Like, you need to be able to look in somebody's eyes and say what you want, what makes you feel good, and ask them that. Like, to me, that is huge. Like, shame is about defacing, taking away your face. And so how do you contradict shame in a relationship? Through communication. Have the lights on, talk face to face, look in their eyes.
How do women reclaim their sexuality in a healthy way, especially in a culture so saturated with objectification?
Yeah. You know, I'm going to steal something that you said, Daniel, one time. Daniel will talk about the word liturgy as something that we do often in church, and we'll do it over and over again, and it's something that can bring us closer to God. But the idea of liturgy as a practice, but sometimes in life we end up practicing things that aren't helpful to us. And in some ways, growing up a woman in our culture, we're getting messages over and over and over again that have almost acted like an unhelpful liturgy. You know, beauty is only defined this way. Perfect is only defined this way. Somehow you're supposed to be a particular something. And objectification is just huge. And so it's acted as a kind of liturgy that hasn't been helpful at all. So we have to, I think, get into a small community of like-minded women, and then we have to practice a new liturgy. And we have to get eye to eye with each other, and we have to say, we have to say to each other what God wants us to hear. You are beautiful. You are fearfully and wonderfully made, exactly as you are. And just keep saying those things over and over again. We have to learn to stand in front of the mirror naked and learn to claim our body as it is, beautiful, perfect, the way it is. We aren't supposed to all be the same. Our bodies aren't supposed to all be the same. So it's just we've been lied to so long, and it might take us as long to keep hearing new messages. So it's not going to change overnight. So you need to get a small band, a small tribe of women, and together you fiercely combat the messages of culture, and you claim what is true. And what you don't want, and I've done this in my life, you guys, I'll look back in scrapbooks from when I was, my daughter's here and she's 23, and she's heard me say this, and I'm like, baby, I had the same body you did at 23, and I think you are just drop dead gorgeous. But when I was 23, I was picking apart my body. I was. And why? Because of the culture I lived in, right? You don't want to look back and see who you are today and see how beautiful you are today, but only be able to recognize it 20 years from now. You are beautiful today. And the lies you've been fed are just that, they're lies. So you have to try to claim that now, and it just takes practice, okay?
And I would just say briefly that it's a both and. Men are as involved in and complicit in this process as women are. So that tribe that Tina's talking about needs to involve us as men as well, that we can speak into women's lives and say, you know what, you're significant because of who you are, not what you do, what you wear, how you perform, but because of who you are. And if we're not explicit about that as men, then we're perpetuating the challenges that women experience in this world as much as they may be for themselves. And I'm mindful as a man that we can get hooked up in the whole objectification process too. So this is really a community issue of really beginning to understand that we are more than just our appearance. We all have a soul, and we're all created intentionally, not on accident, to be who we are in relationships with other people. So how can we show up in ways that are about communing versus performing, about being versus objectifying? And that's a call for all of us to take seriously.
I have to just add a little bit. Amen. But I do want to address, I think, the pushback against this whole creepy culture we live in that objectifies women and their bodies and distorts the tar out of them. I think the pushback against that is to sort of say, well, our bodies don't matter. What matters is what's inside. And I want to say, yes, that is true. What inside does matter. And yes, I agree that we need to start telling our little girls, wow, I love how you're reading that book. You're so creative, rather than, wow, those are cute shoes, even if they are. I absolutely agree with that. But what I want to caution against, though, is swinging too much that way divorces ourselves from our bodies and says that our bodies don't matter. What matters is only what's inside. Our bodies do matter, but not in the way that our culture says it does. So we bless our minds, and we bless our hearts, and we bless our creativity and how we think and feel and speak, and we also bless our breasts, and we bless our booties and everything. We love those things in all their different shapes and sizes because they're good as they are. They're good, as is all of you.
Next question is, how do we avoid shame while fostering responsibility and holiness?
So, since I've been, harping on holiness all night, I might as well continue. I would say that holiness itself is the derailing and undoing of shame. That by practicing those rhythms of calling out the goodness in ourselves and in one another, by naming and contradicting messages of shame with messages of truth about who we are as human beings. That's the actual undoing. So that holiness, as we're cultivating that, we're actually undoing that. So I use that word cultivating because I garden and I love gardening. And the best defense against bugs coming and getting in your garden is not insecticide. The best defense is really, really, really healthy and really, really, really diverse plant life. So by having a lot of different unique kinds of plants side by side, all of them flourishing, giving them what they want so that they're healthy and strong and thriving, then it protects them all. They're all stronger, they're all healthier. You get much more produce from that garden. That's the kind of holiness isn't this individual thing of like, oh, I'm holy, but this person over here isn't because I'm doing this and they're not doing that. No, like we're communally responsible for each other. So when we talk about objectification, like that's a social engagement that we're doing together. Holiness is worked out together. It's the love of God and neighbors. It's a community thing. So I think that's where like the shame, we undo shame when we practice that kind of orientation of blessing, offering God's blessing, the idea that Jesus moves towards us and makes us holy. It's less about our being faithful to God, but God is faithful to us. God created us good, and God wants to continue to make us good.
I feel like we try to please both faith and physical wants by doing everything except sex. How do we balance it?
I'm assuming you're talking about like blowjobs and stuff like that, except the actual sex act. And I just want to tell you that that is sex. And, you know, having your hands on one another's body, that's part of sex. Kissing down people's necks and all over, that is sex. I think that one of the interesting things, again, kind of how, going back to what Tina said, is that we tend to sort of want to know how far can we go, rather than asking the question, like, what is the best? So when it comes to pleasing your faith and physical wants, I mean, what's the best? What's the best there? Doing everything except sex, I would be rather unfulfilling.
Well, this feels like a quantity versus quality question. Like, let's shift it away from the quantity section of how much of this can I get versus like, well, how good can it be? Like if that's then it takes us into a different framework, and it makes those lines a lot harder to mess with, which I think is a good thing. Like, the more complex we can make this question, the better. Rather than simplifying it to which rules can I follow so that I can stay safe. Like, God doesn't want you to be safe. I'm sorry. I am so sorry. My life experience tells me that living is dangerous and thriving is costly and painful, but it is so deeply good. God does not want you to be safe.
And relationships are super risky. If you want to live a safe life, don't love. Right? The deeper you love, the deeper you'll risk. Right? Don't reduce sex to a behavior. Because it's not just a behavior. Any more than you walk into a room and leave your gender behind. You're always all of you when you walk into a room. So even though you've grown up in a church that reduced sex to intercourse and live in a culture that reduces sex to intercourse, that's the vernacular we use, don't fall prey to reducing sex to a behavior. What can I do and not do? That's reducing it to a behavior. Make your sexuality about honoring you, honoring God, honoring other, and make it as good and as wonderful and as blessed and as awesome as it can be. And yes, it'll be risky and complicated.
Pastor Amy mentioned that we shouldn't read Christian advice books. We'll just leave it at that. Then how do we become educated and learn more?
And I meant marriage books. There's lots of good Christian books out there. Don't just
She's
ban
reeling,
all Christian
backpedaling.
books. I think Tina and Shawn might have some good sex books, because I think that's what you're looking for, right? Not just advice. Like, you're looking for some books to educate you on sexuality and gender.
We have a lot on the website, on the Thank God for Sex website and the resource section, so definitely go there. We're going to have, at Naked City Pub on May 19th, we're going to have another adult sex ed night where we're going to we're going to teach some stuff, and we're going to open it up for questions there again. So again, education, education, education. And just when you are reading anything, be discerning, okay? And you can at any time shoot a question to Shawn or myself or any of these guys through the website. If you read something and you're not quite sure about it, or it doesn't sit right with you, shoot us a question. We'll give you our thoughts. And again, they're just our thoughts. But there's a lot of stuff that I read that I kind of go like this too, so be discerning. That's good.
And because I don't work here and can kind of say more of whatever I want, some of your education on this might begin in your bathtub. By which I mean, like, to understand your sexuality, you need to understand your own body. You need to know your body and what you want. And that may mean masturbating. That may mean taking some time and figuring out what feels good in my body. What does my body desire? In a culture and church and family, whatever messages you have, if those things have kept you from knowing yourself, then it's going to be really hard to openly communicate with somebody else about what you want if you don't know what that is. And so that's going to be an important part of education for you, is to understand what is the body that God has given you. This is the one body you get, barring, the farthest reaches of sci-fi, which I love. But this is the one you get. This is your sexuality. So figure out how to enjoy the heck out of it.
You're right, you must not work here because you said masturbating.
And bathtub. We don't have those in the halls anymore.
Well,
Even if you did, you wouldn't want to get in them. It's not a wise choice. I've seen them. Okay.
If you have already decided to wait to have sex or intercourse until marriage, how would you suggest maintaining a healthy sexuality while single?
I can't remember if bathtub, really? Oh, I wasn't supposed to repeat that. Okay. I can't remember if it was Amy or Tina that said this earlier, but one of you talked about kind of leaning into, or I'm going to paraphrase, leaning into and practicing, your desire, your sexuality, really embracing it as a part of yourself. And one of the things that I encourage couples to do, particularly if they have made a commitment to waiting to have intercourse until marriage, is to practice sexual intimacy in the context of their dating and courting relationship. And the reason why I say that is because sexuality isn't just intercourse, despite the messages that some of us have received growing up. Sexuality, as Amy was talking about a little bit ago, involves everything from kissing to touching to other sexual acts, including intercourse. But if that's off the table for you, and that's a mutual decision that you're making, the best way to honor yourself and your partner is to practice sexual intimacy now. And the reason why is because it's a discipline. It really isn't something that you just all of a sudden know and intuitively do with your partner. It requires practice. It requires the ability to maintain eye contact with each other for more than a couple of minutes. It requires holding each other's hands when other people that you've dated or other family and friends are around. It involves hugging until you're relaxed, not just the obligatory 3-second peck on the cheek and at a girl or at a boy on the shoulder. I mean, it's a discipline. It's a process. And it's something, to be honest with you, after 10 plus years of marriage, I'm still practicing with my wife. And I wish I would have had somebody encouraging me to practice it sooner than we did, because we'd be further along now. But we're all in that journey of learning what it means to experience sexual intimacy in our lives, and that's a discipline that we have to practice. So go home and tell your parents that people that work at SPU told you to practice sexual intimacy before you got married, and see the look on their faces. It'll be priceless.
I would suggest, what I would suggest too, is learn to pay attention to your body and what's happening with it and what you're craving. Whether it be, do they allow them to drink? Yes. I don't know. Whether it be a good glass of wine, a great microbrew.
You're 21 and over.
If you're 21. A great steak, cooked just the way you like it. Or a piece of clothing. A really soft shirt that feels good against your skin, a great blanket, or a great piece of music that you can just dive yourself into. Engage in activities that use your body, that cause you to be aware of your body, like dance, whether it's, jazz dance or whatever, or contra dancing, do a class like that. I kickbox. I hurt my leg a little bit ago, but I kickbox, and there's something about using your body in a powerful way to impact someone else, and you're not trying to hurt them, but just seeing what your body can do. That's really sensuous. It's amazing. And so I hesitate to say, make everything a sexual experience, but it's part of that. It's part of what Shawn was talking about, like engage in sexual intimacy, like sexual practices. That's your body, like learning what feels good in your body, doing what feels good in your body, using your body physically to impact the around you and in ways that feel challenging and good and fun. Those are all components that later on, when you get to engage in the full meal deal, that you're gonna know what you like, and it's a great way to practice that, and it's a great way to exercise those muscles.
So I'm going to throw this on its head just a little bit. So my husband and I do intimacy retreats for couples, and Shawn helps with this as well. And one of the things we do, and these are with married couples, is we take intercourse off the table for 3 days.
What?
Yes, we do. Why? Because couples get in a rut of only doing things in a particular way once they start doing the full meal deal. They do step 1, 2, 3, 4, kiss, goodnight, over, okay? And they forget that there are a million ways to make love happen. So one of the best things you can do if you're gonna take something off the table, like not having intercourse until you get married or something else, learn to make love in a million different ways, keeping something that you're not doing. It actually keeps things kind of exciting. After you get married and you can do everything, take something off the table and make love a million different ways, not trying to do that one thing. It keeps it kind of exciting. For 2 weeks, let's not do this. For 2 weeks, let's not do that. So it's actually can be kind of fun and playful, and you won't get yourself in a kind of a rut. Just remember, we have been incredibly organized by intercourse for thousands of years. And really, it's about connection and pleasure. And if you're not sharing connection and you're not sharing pleasure, you've missed the point of this gift.
Can you give some tips on how to support others dealing with sexual shame?
love them and listen to them and be really compassionate.
I just love the questions asked, right? That someone in this room cares about somebody else in that way. That's the type of friend that we would all be lucky to have, first of all. And second of all, as Tina said, we use this model in our graduate program to train therapists, some of which are in the room right now, called Orca, after the beautiful orca whales that you can sometimes see out in Puget Sound, to stand for a posture, a way of being with other people, that we would hope to embody openness, respect, curiosity, and accountability to power and influence. That somehow, some way, if we can posture ourselves with other people in that way, particularly around things like sexual shame, the shame will start to go away. And in turn, we're going to feel, as the one who initially provided the support, the courage to then seek support as well, because it's contagious in that way.
That was our last question.
So can we give a big round of applause to our guests here this evening? I am sure that if you wanted to talk to any one of these people, they would be willing to hang out in the lobby for a little while and chat with you personally. A couple of reminders we want to give you before you leave. One is those salmon-colored feedback forms that we gave you. If you want to fill that out and put your name and ID number on it, we're going to enter all of those that have that information on it into a raffle for a gift card. So we'd love to hear your feedback. Laura's standing at the back door, and Joel with some baskets to take those back from you, as well as the pencils. We have one more night of events for our Let's Talk About Sex and Faith and Relationships, and that is this Thursday evening. It's the women-only and men-only conversations. Ladies' night is in Hill Hall Lounge from 8 to 10 p.m., and we'll be doing some story sharing from a panel, have some time of reflection, and some good women-only question and answer time. Manversations, Sex and Pizza, is happening in the Collegium in the sub from 8:30 to 10:30 on Thursday as well. Yes, there's ice cream for the women and pizza for the guys on that evening. So we hope that you'll join us for that really incredible night of sort of talking amongst ourselves just with our genders. So thank you guys for coming. Have a wonderful evening, and thank you again to all these wonderful folks.
I wanted to say something before you say something. Thanks so much for coming tonight. We're mindful that this conversation requires people to continue having it, and maybe some of the people that needed to have this conversation the most aren't here. So take this to them in hopes that we can continue this forward.
And there are flyers if you'd like to come to the next Thank God for Sex event outside, so feel free to grab those on your way out, and also cards on the website, so feel free to grab those too. Thanks for coming.